Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Today's video.
Hey guys, so I know of General Montgomery, right? World War II. I know of him, but I know next to nothing about him. So we are doing a biographics video, preemptive like Bernard Montgomery, the Spartan general. My name's Connor. If you're new, I forget what I said. Hope everyone's doing well. Original link, top of the description.
Video sponsored by
NordVPN.
NordVPN, which is helping to give internet users a proper 21st century online experience. Now, you may have heard me talk about what NordVPN can do for you previously. Encrypt your internet data, move your activity to another location with just a single click, either for superior security or just for better streaming options on Netflix, etc. And all of that is still true. NordVPN has more than 5,500 servers in 59 countries, but VPNs give you access to so much more than just new TV shows. With
ad,
Nord,
obviously.
you can really do it all, and that includes utilizing their threat protection upgrade, which blocks ads, eradicates web trackers, checks for malware, and much more. Look, right now, you guys can get a unique deal. You can get a 2-year plan at a huge discount, plus 4 additional months totally for free. And look, if you try NordVPN and change your mind, if you don't like it, which I can't see why you wouldn't, but you'll get a 30-day money-back guarantee. And all you got to do is go to nordvpn.com/bio. Again, that's nordvpn.com/bio. 2-year deal, huge
Use the
discount,
/bio,
4
guys,
months
if
for
you're
free.
interested.
There's a link below. And now today's video. In 1942, the Second World War was going badly for Great Britain. Their army had been thoroughly beaten by the Germans in France, in the Mediterranean, and in North Africa, and the island was still being subjected to regular bombardments by the Luftwaffe. British generals looked completely inept and foolish compared to their German counterparts, and what the public and Winston Churchill desperately needed was someone who could turn that situation around. They found it in the person of General Bernard Montgomery, one of the most controversial figures on the Allied side of World War II. Undoubtedly, he was a brilliant battlefield commander, staging some of the European theatre's most impressive victories. But he was also vain, egotistical, and a bully, beloved by his soldiers but utterly detested by his colleagues and superiors.
Tasmanian Devil.
Bernard Law Montgomery was born on November the 17th, 1887 in South London. His father, Henry, an Anglican clergyman, was named Bishop of Tasmania 2 years after Bernard was born, and the family would spend most of his childhood living on the small island off the coast of mainland Australia. Henry would spend months at a time in the rural hinterlands of Tasmania acting as a missionary, leaving his wife Maud in charge of Bernard and his 8 siblings. Maud's preferred form of discipline was...
Were there natives on Tasmania? I'm sure there were. I mean, there were some on New Zealand, right? But were they more Polynesian or Aboriginal, I wonder? I never thought about that.
Wife Maud in charge of Bernard and his 8 siblings. Maud's preferred form of discipline was ruthlessly beating her children for the slightest of infractions, and young Bernard spent as much time as possible out of the house. So much ill feeling built up towards his mother that in later life he would refuse to have anything to do with her. Montgomery's troubled childhood made him into something of a bully with a tendency towards cruelty at times. He was very nearly expelled from the Royal Military College at Sandhurst after a hazing incident ended with a fellow cadet in the hospital severely burned after Montgomery had set his shirt on fire. He survived the near miss, however, and was commissioned as a British Army officer in 1908. Monty, as his military colleagues called him, served with distinction in the First World War. He received a very serious wound in October 1914 that almost claimed his life, but he survived and ended the war as a major. He was still a major 10 years later, though. His superiors were continually annoyed by his tendency to stick his nose in other people's business and his overall arrogance. In 1927, he married Betty Carver, a war widow with 2 sons, to which they added a 3rd son, David, in 1928. The marriage probably saved Montgomery's army career, as Betty rounded out some of the more prickly sides of Monty's personality. 10 years after they were married, Montgomery was a brigadier on the fast track to his general stars when tragedy struck. While on holiday, an insect bite Betty received became infected and she died of sepsis. Montgomery was heartbroken. He threw himself back into his work, and there was soon plenty of that to be had.
Not to say that can't happen today, you know, insect bites. I am so thankful for all of the revolutionary things that scientists did in the medical scientists were not in the 20th century that just made a lot of what would be considered today needless deaths thing in the past, which man,
They had.
thank you, whoever you were. in the
On
past.
September the 1st, 1939, Hitler invaded Poland, touching off World War II. Major General Montgomery, newly appointed commander of the 3rd Infantry Division, was dispatched to France as part of the British Expeditionary Force commanded by Lord Gort. In Battle of France in May 1940, the German Wehrmacht took the Allies by surprise with a blitzkrieg offensive through the Ardennes forest, successfully outflanking the BEF and 3 entire French armies, cutting them off from the rest of the country. As the rest of the French army collapsed, the BEF was evacuated from the port of Dunkirk along with thousands of French troops. Montgomery performed admirably under trying circumstances, but he earned himself no friends when he returned to London and immediately started telling everyone from Winston Churchill on down how badly he felt the war in France had been fought and how he believed it should be done correctly. The fact that these plans usually involved himself in them did not go unnoticed by his superiors.
The fact that the country that was so badly that was defeated in the First World War and so badly, reparations and the penalties of the Treaty of Versailles was actually the one. This is going to be a giant lesson to learn, that the one who lost in the most bloody and insane large scale war in history in World War I, then was the one that was ready and well oiled and well put together army to go against the winners that did so poorly in the beginning of the war. It's got to be a lesson there.
And this would be a
stay on your toes.
Usually involved himself in them, did not go unnoticed by his superiors, and this would be a consistent theme for the remainder of Monty's war. He also personally irritated Churchill. Montgomery was fitness conscious, he didn't smoke, drink, or eat meat, and he exercised vigorously. This moderate lifestyle, which earned him the nickname the Spartan General, was held up by Montgomery as an ideal standard of living, no doubt part of his overall penchant for vanity and self-promotion. For the pot-bellied Churchill, famous for his affinity for cigars and whiskey, Montgomery came across as a preachy know-it-all. As a result of his unpopularity, he was passed over for combat commands, restricted to posts in southern England. 2 years passed, and still Montgomery was...
It's so interesting to think about world leaders and these people that are such large historical figures like Churchill, and just seeing them as real people who have these little, pet peeves and annoyances with other people. I hate that historical figures are, maybe I shouldn't speak for everyone, but are given this sort of status that they weren't a normal person that had a brain like you and I and had difficulties with certain people. I love seeing that aspect, or that side of history.
Combat commands restricted to posts in southern England. 2 years passed, and still Montgomery was left chafing at home, helpless to do anything but watch as defeat after defeat was inflicted upon the Allies. France had surrendered in 1940. The British were defeated by the Germans in Greece and on Crete. The Japanese had entered the war in 1941, dragging the United States with them, and they had seized the British colonies of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma, while taking the Philippines from the United States. On the Eastern Front, the Germans had penetrated deep into the Soviet Union, almost to the doorstep of Stalin's Dachau in Moscow. And in North Africa, the British had been forced out of Tunisia and had 33,000 soldiers taken prisoner when the city of Tobruk fell in June 1942. The British Eighth Army had been chased across Libya to...
Let me say one thing. I was going to say the same thing goes for... This is why I have to just speak my mind, because then I keep thinking about it and I can't listen. But I was going to say the same goes for Japan, but Japan wasn't on the losing side in World War I. But I think that the countries that tend to be on the top, right, and have a very stable economy and stable culture, country, and have a very good place in the world, where and I think there's this sort of something happens where if you're at the top for too long and you start to think that every country in the world kind of thinks the way you do. And that makes it really easy for other countries to start scheming and catch you off guard. And I don't know if the solution is just never trust anyone and always be on your guard. But I think there's a complacency that comes with I don't want to say too much peace, as if that's a bad thing, with long periods of peace and prosperity. Other countries aren't experiencing that same peace or prosperity, but want to. And I think we need to think about that. Just, not every country wants to play by the same rules because they're not living the same life that you are. So, yeah.
One dragging the United Germans in Greece and on Crete. The Japanese had entered the war in 1941.
Sorry, I'm not sorry. the Japanese, for example, they want oil, right? They're too helpless without American oil, and then America has the ability to cut off the oil. And do you think that the country, I think often we think the countries are just going to take it, you know? And I'm not justifying breakouts of these large wars, but I think it's naive and to think that everyone's okay with you holding all the power and then following international rules and whatnot. So does that make sense? Anyway, that'll be the last thing I'll say about that, I think.
Greece did upon the Allies. France had surrendered in 1940. The British were defeated by the Germans in Greece and on Crete. The Japanese had entered the war in 1941, dragging the United States with them, and they had seized the British colonies of Hong Kong, Singapore, and Burma, while taking the Philippines from the United States. On the Eastern Front, the Germans had penetrated deep into the Soviet Union, almost to the doorstep of Stalin's Dachau in Moscow. And in North Africa, the British had been forced out of Tunisia and had 33,000 soldiers taken prisoner when the city of Tobruk fell in June 1942. The British 8th Army had been chased across Libya to Egypt by the German Africa Corps, commanded by Desert Fox Field Marshal Owen Rommel, one of Germany's best generals. Rommel was now within striking distance of seizing the Suez Canal, which would cripple the Allies' supply pipeline, and beyond that were the oil fields of the Middle East, desperately needed by the fuel-hungry German panzers. The 8th Army had to stop Rommel at all costs, but Churchill felt that the generals currently employed down there weren't the ones for the job. Monty was about to get his chance.
Hold on.
Beyond that were the oil fields of the Middle East, desperately needed by the fuel-hungry German panzers.
I thought the whole reason Germany had to invade Russia and go for the Russian Caucasus, the Russian Caucasus oil fields, was because that was the only place with with proven currently acting oil stuff. So if there was oil in the Middle East, why didn't the Germans, instead of provoking Russia, just push that invasion to the Middle East? And
the 8th on that were the oil fields of the Middle East, desperately needed by the fuel-hungry German panzers. The 8th Army had to stop Rommel at all costs, but Churchill felt that the generals currently employed down there weren't the ones for the job. Monty was about to get his chance. General Claude Auchinleck was serving as both commander of the 8th Army and as commander-in-chief of all forces in the Middle East. Churchill flew to Africa and fired him from both roles, replacing him as commander-in-chief with General Harold Alexander and as 8th Army commander with General William Gott. The next day, however, Gott was killed when his plane was shot down, leaving Churchill at a loss for who to appoint next. Since 1941, the chief of the Imperial General Staff, the head of the British Army, had been General Alan Brooke, Montgomery's corps commander in France. Brooke recommended Montgomery as 8th Army commander, arguing that while he was personally difficult, he was at heart a professional soldier and an excellent leader of troops. Churchill relented, and on August the 8th, 1942, Monty was given the appointment that would make him a household name worldwide. 5 days later, Monty took command of a demoralized and disorganized army that was accustomed to retreat. He immediately set about refitting it, making a point to visit every unit under his new command so that the soldiers could see him. His supreme self-confidence, which had so annoyed his colleagues over the years, was exactly what the troops needed to see. The message was clear to everyone. The losing, it stops now. 2 weeks after taking command, Rommel tested Monty for the first time. In a 5-day engagement known as the Battle of Alam el Halfa, the Germans, backed by their Italian allies, attempted to flank the British Army, trying to draw them out of their prepared defensive positions where they could be destroyed. Instead, they ran into a trap. Montgomery placed the bulk of his tanks on top of a ridge 20 miles behind the lines. They sat up there immobile, acting as anti-tank guns to blast apart the panzers. Combined with a coordinated air attack from the Desert Air Force, the British armor saw off the attack and Rommel ordered a retreat. Over the next month, Montgomery steadily built up his forces, and then on October the 23rd, he unleashed them in the climactic Battle of El Alamein. For 10 days, the 8th Army, made up of units from India, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Greece, and France, in addition to British troops, sought to break through the German and Italian lines. A brutal war of attrition that Montgomery knew he would win. Finally, with supplies, especially gasoline, running dangerously low, Rommel was forced to retreat with his mobile units, leaving most of his infantry to be captured. Now it was Rommel's turn to go on the run, with Montgomery chasing after him. That chase would end in Tunisia in May 1943, when the 8th Army, now joined up with Allied units who had invaded Morocco in Operation Operation Torch forced what was left of the Afrika Korps to surrender. Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was evacuated beforehand.
This is the part about war that I understand why it's done. You need people to be infantry troops, and in the very utilitarian is that the right word? Mindset of the military, where if you're not as efficient and good and as powerful as the enemy, you're going to lose, and then everyone suffers. But the idea that because you're a new soldier, you're young, you're more inexperienced, that means that you're the person that will be the infantry, and you know the mindset of old men start wars and young men fight them. Where I see the injustice in that, I also think to myself, well, how else is it going to happen? How else? Just don't start wars? Oh, that's easy. Wow, thank you. Well, no, of course not. And so I do see the injustice in that saying. There's no remedy to it. What are you going to do when someone attacks you? But I can't let that not kind of anger me a bit and just feel so injustice. It's like, nope, you have to be the guy that's gonna die. That when gasoline is low, your armored troops abandon you. And honestly, if I were a commander, I feel like I would have to do it the same way. Still, it feels so unjust. I just don't have a solution. Just being like, oh, yep, sorry, we got to get the armor away. I get it, still hate it. That's what I'm trying to say.
Rommel, Hitler's favorite general, was evacuated beforehand. El Alamein was the first major Allied victory in the European theatre of the war, and overnight, Monty was everybody's favorite general. He was given a knighthood and promoted, and the British press were quick to heap laurels upon him, proclaiming him the best British general since the Duke of Wellington. The most important impression he was to make, though, was not with the British public, but with his American allies. And it wasn't a good one.
Was that Patton? I heard Patton was, actually, I don't know if I'm right enough to even say it. It was kind of difficult to, actually, I think it was the opposite of Montgomery. I'm just spewing things that could easily be wrong. Never mind, just let's watch.
Quick to heap laurels upon him, proclaiming him the best British general since the Duke of Wellington. The most important impression he was to make, though, was not with the British public, but with his American allies. And it wasn't a good one. The next Allied operation was the invasion of the Italian island of Sicily, Operation Husky. For the first time, Montgomery and the 8th Army would be working in concert with the Americans, including his new commanding officer, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower had a difficult job as the commander of all Allied forces in the European theater, trying to balance the expectations of his bosses in Washington with those of the other members of the Western Allied coalition, and successfully fight the war at the same time. Monty didn't make things easy for him when it came to Operation Husky, however. Montgomery insisted that the plans for the operation were all wrong and threatened to resign if the plan he put forward wasn't followed to the letter. Just as he'd expected, Monty got his way, but he had encountered on the commander of the US 7th Army, General George Patton, being just as much of a prima donna as he was. Patton, nicknamed Old Blood and Guts, was similar in many ways to Montgomery. Both had difficult relationships with their superiors. While being beloved by their subordinates, they craved glory on the battlefield and the publicity it brought, and they were skilled generals in mobile armored warfare. In hindsight, they were probably too alike to be expected to work together without controversy. The invasion of Sicily was ultimately successful, but because the two army commanders spent more time trying to one-up each other than working together, over 100,000 Axis troops that might have been cut off and captured managed to escape to the Italian mainland. With Patton sidelined by press reports that he slapped and berated two soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, which is today known as PTSD, Montgomery's next job as 8th Army commander was the invasion of the Italian peninsula. Once again, the campaign was marked by poor Allied coordination in the face of determined German resistance, the Italians having switched sides and surrendered to the Allies by this point. Montgomery bitterly complained in his diary and to his...
When the war switches from, and he just said as Italian, that the Italians like switch sides there, as the war switches from uncertainty to sort of a sure thing, I'm sure it goes from, just who has the best plan in the former case, who has the best plan, what is the best way we can succeed, to now it's like, all right, we're going to win. How do I be that amazing, now that us winning seems to be, going to happen. And it's less about just the perfect plan happening no matter what, and more about who does it, then I'm sure that's how a lot of this headbutting happens. There's a lot of the glory aspect. Who knows?
Areas in London about the disjointed effort, but the uncomfortable truth was that the Battle of Italy was a sideshow, and everyone knew it. The real hammer blow.
And I mean, the D-Day hadn't happened yet, right? So I mean, it wasn't a sure thing, but stuff was definitely bending towards an Axis defeat.
Come in France, where the Allies were preparing the cross-channel invasion known as Operation Overlord. The truth was that the Battle of Italy was a sideshow, and everyone knew it. The real hammer blow would come in France, where the Allies were preparing the cross-channel invasion known as Operation Overlord. The plan was to land American, British, and Canadian troops on the beaches of Normandy, punching through the fortifications of Hitler's fortress Europe, liberating Paris from the Nazis' grip, and pushing on to Germany itself. Once again, their supreme commander, Eisenhower, would oversee the operation. Allied cohesion dictated that a British general serve as his commander in the field during the initial stages of the invasion. But which one? Eisenhower wanted General Alexander because the other choice, Montgomery, he felt was too difficult to work with. General Brooke, however, successfully convinced Churchill that Monty was a better tactical general than Alexander, so Montgomery got the job and was brought home to London, leaving the 8th Army behind in Italy after 18 months commanding it. Montgomery worked his magic on the assault troops, making sure to visit all of his units as he did with the 8th Army, raising morale. Monty was a proven winner, and that's what the nervous armies needed right now. After all, the last successful cross-channel...
Kind of goes against what I was just saying, doesn't it? Still nervous, they need the right guy for the job. I think to save myself, all right, I think that mindset probably does happen
invasion of
maybe a little bit further down in the war. So that might have been my
William the Conqueror
mistake there of assuming the war was so sure at the point it was. That's my
needed right now. After all, the last successful cross-channel invasion had been done by William the Conqueror 900 years before. Despite many hardships, on June the 6th, 1944, the largest amphibious landing in the history of the world took place. The Allies successfully landed 5 divisions in France, 150,000 men. Montgomery, in addition to being overall commander, was also commander of the 21st Army Group, which consisted of the 2nd British Army and eventually the 1st Canadian Army. American General Omar Bradley, meanwhile, commanded the 12th Army Group, initially consisting of the 1st Army and later joined by the 3rd and the 9th. The Allies found it tough going. The British and Canadians were pinned down by increasing numbers of German troops, which prevented them from capturing the strategic city of Caen. The Americans, meanwhile, found it difficult to successfully traverse the countryside, which was broken up into a series of irregularly shaped and tall hedgerows known as bocage, which the Germans used to their advantage to make life difficult for the invaders. Eventually, Montgomery was forced to use his British and Canadian troops like a shield, holding the Germans in place while the Americans swung around like a door hinge. Finally, after 2 months of battle, the US 3rd Army, commanded by Patton, broke out and wheeled around to the south of the Germans, trapping them in between the Americans and the British. 10,000 Germans died and 50,000 were captured in the Filet Pocket. German resistance crumbled at this point, and the Allies raced for Paris and the German border. A great victory had been won, but controversy reigned over what to do next. The British believed a single thrust by the entire group of 4 armies should be made through Belgium and Holland and then attack.
I feel like this is that point, I would say.
Single thrust by the entire group and won, but controversy reigned over what to do next. The British believed a single thrust by the entire group of 4 armies should be made through Belgium and Holland and then attack the German industrial heartland, the Ruhr Valley. Eisenhower, however, favored a broad front strategy, which included separating the American and British armies, having the British attack to the north and the Americans to the south. Monty was also chafed at Eisenhower when the latter decided to take command of the armies currently in the field on September the 1st, leaving Montgomery only in command of the 21st Army Group. Once Once again, Montgomery complained to London, claiming Eisenhower didn't know what was going on and questioning his fitness to command. He also made himself look petulant when he refused Eisenhower's invitation to participate in the celebrations surrounding the liberation of Paris. But it was Montgomery who wasn't able to appreciate the whole picture, not Eisenhower. By this point, 75% of the troops in Europe were American, with more coming over every week. The American public would not accept a British commander in charge of a large number of American troops for the remainder of the war. Bradley also wanted nothing more to do with Montgomery, who he regarded as overcautious, pompous, and entirely too preoccupied with getting his picture in the newspaper. But to the British, he was still their man. Hoping to placate him somewhat, Churchill promoted Monty to the rank of Field Marshal.
I don't know, saying, oh, come on. I keep backtracking statements, right? I don't know about this stuff of, who's right or wrong. Maybe he was, disrespected in some manner.
By September 1944, the Allied advance was running out of steam. They were running into the heavily fortified secret line on the German border, and their supplies were still coming ashore in Normandy, hundreds of miles to the rear. What they needed was a deep water port on the Channel coast, like Antwerp, which had been liberated on the 4th. But the port couldn't be used because the Germans still held the entrance to the Scheldt estuary, which controlled access to the port. Many top Allied commanders believed that Montgomery should focus on clearing the Scheldt above everything else, but Monty, still focused on his own plan for invading the Ruhr Valley in Germany, proclaimed that he had a better idea: Operation Market Garden. Market Garden would see 3 divisions of paratroopers dropped near the Dutch cities of Eindhoven, Nijmegen, and Arnhem to seize the river crossings in each one. Then British armored units would race up the road to secure these bridges, the last of which in Arnhem was across the Rhine River, the roadway into Germany itself. If successful, the Allies could have flanked the secret line and possibly win the war in Europe before the end of the year. The fact that the plan was overambitious only revealed itself after the battle was over. The British tanks never made it to Arnhem, and the paratroopers there took dreadful casualties. Though dressed up as a victory for propaganda purposes, Market Garden was in reality a strategic failure that did nothing to hasten the end of the war and cost the Allies 15,000 casualties. Montgomery, chatting for one of the first times in his life, would admit later that Market Garden was a mistake, though he took great pains to qualify it by proclaiming that if it had been properly supported with supplies from headquarters, that it could have been successful. Belatedly, Montgomery turned his attention to Antwerp, by which time the Scheldt had been reinforced by the Wehrmacht. The Canadian army would suffer another 12,000 casualties before they were able to open the port on November the 28th. In December, it was the turn of the Americans to be humiliated. Hitler, failing to grasp the reality that the war was lost, gathered all of his remaining strength for a bold strike against the Western Allies. Knowing of the friction between Montgomery and Bradley, he hoped to divide the 2 army groups, recapture Antwerp, and cut the Allies off from their supplies. If he could force the Americans and the British to sign a separate peace deal with Germany, he could then turn all of his forces on the Soviets, bearing down on him from the east.
Just want to make a quick point/question. All right. I think, me kind of thinking about my, like, when I'm like, oh, come on, Montgomery, don't do that, kind of petty thing of not going to the victory thing in France, whatever. Not that important to my point here. I think that this shows us how historical figures are just, they're people like everyone else, and they're given, a lot of historical figures are given this holy, like, this status that makes them almost seem not human. But at the end of the day, everyone is human with the same exact sort of emotions that you and I have. And I'm not saying some aren't more disciplined or aren't different in some ways, right? Hot temper or whatnot. This seems like it's just normal. I'm sure this has happened in wars throughout history, or conflicts throughout history. Is a giant aspect of that is just the individual emotions and personalities of generals and other significant people in wartime. So I just wanted to say that.
On December the 16th, the Germans took the American First Army by complete surprise, suddenly attacking from the Ardennes.
Humanize historical figures more. I think we should. I just spoke like Yoda.
Germany, he could then turn all of his forces on the Soviets, bearing down on him from the east. On December the 16th, the Germans took the American First Army by complete surprise, suddenly attacking from the Ardennes just as they had done to the French in 1940. 400,000 men and 1,400 tanks smashed into the American positions, which quickly gave way under the onslaught. General Bradley, who had been focused on the offensives he was planning, was flabbergasted. Radio communication was cut off, so he wasn't sure what was going on. The Germans pushed west, creating a salient or bulge in the Allied lines. Newspapers dubbed the engagement the Battle of the Bulge. With things reaching a crisis point, Eisenhower directed that the 1st and 9th American armies, which were now pinned north of the Bulge, should be temporarily transferred to Montgomery's command. Monty couldn't seem to help but gloat at the predicament of the Americans, portraying himself as the man who rode in and saved the day to both his British superiors and to the press. For a man that hardly ever admitted to making a mistake, he sure was quick to point out perceived failures that he saw in others. For Eisenhower, this was the last straw. While, yes, Bradley had made a mistake, there was no need to humiliate the man that many viewed as one of the US Army's most professional soldiers. He planned to send a message to both Washington and London, proclaiming that either Monty goes or he would. Realizing that he had gone too far, that Churchill would not protect him if the cost was the risk of the entire alliance falling apart, Montgomery was quick to apologize. Eisenhower was persuaded to keep him in command. Meanwhile, the German offensive...
Hitler's gamble that he, or that he heard that there was some friction between Montgomery and, British and American commanders, and that was actually the case. That, just the threat of pulling out completely or was really there. Wow. All right.
Montgomery was quick to apologize. Eisenhower was persuaded to keep him in command. Meanwhile, the German offensive in Belgium was never destined to do more than give the Allies a bloody nose. They didn't have enough left of anything: food, fuel, ammunition, men, to sustain the offensive for more than 2 weeks. And once the dismal winter weather cleared and the Allies could start to utilize their overwhelming air superiority to attack the Germans, the offensive stalled out. Fierce American defenders had held the line, and it would be General Patton that would get the glory from this fight with his famous counterattack with the Third Army. Montgomery, meanwhile, seemed to be receiving nothing but scorn. The Bulge had consumed...
I think it's super rare for extremely capable men who also don't have any problems, right? Because personal, hard to work with or whatever. Because I think a lot of the time you can't separate those things. A lot of the time, I'm sure it's a lot of the bad qualities people saw in Montgomery that made him so good in other areas, right? And so, although it seems like he was a very, putting it lightly, just a very difficult person to work with, you can't argue with his success in certain areas and military capabilities.
The best of Germany's remaining military. The Bulge had consumed the best of Germany's remaining military strength in the West, and once it failed, the entire had consumed the best of Germany's remaining military strength in the West, and once it failed, the entire battle line began to collapse. In March 1945, the Allies crossed the Rhine and began racing across Germany. By the start of April, the war was all but won. Montgomery believed it was possible for him to make a dash with his army group to Berlin to get there before the Russians, but Bradley took the wind out of his sails when he insisted to Eisenhower that his 9th Army, which had been under Monty's command since the Bulge, be returned to him. Using only his British and Canadian troops, Monty wouldn't be able to get to Berlin. And then he was specifically ordered not to by Eisenhower, who decided that the Elbe River was to be the boundary between Western and Soviet zones. Eisenhower knew that the Yalta Conference had already determined that Germany and Berlin were to be split up into occupation zones post-war, and since Berlin was within the Soviet area, why should he expend American lives trying to capture it? Of course, Eisenhower probably didn't realize what Churchill was starting to do by this point, that Stalin, every bit the brutal dictator that Hitler was, had no intention of relinquishing control of the territories that he conquered from the Germans. Promises to hold elections proved hollow as the Soviets set up a series of communist satellite states in Eastern Europe, setting the stage for the Cold War. But at the time, it seemed most important to win the war against the Nazis and the Japanese. As they say, hindsight's 2020. Monty's war ended on May the 4th when he accepted the surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. He remained in Germany as part of the Army of Occupation until 1946, when he was promoted to Chief of the Imperial General Staff to replace Field Marshal Brooke, a post he held until 1948. He served as Deputy Commander of NATO from its creation until his retirement in 1958. After leaving military life, he published his memoirs, which were deeply critical of Eisenhower and others, including Gort, Auchinleck, Patton, and Bradley. The book produced immediate blowback, especially from the United States, and has engendered controversy ever since. He served in the House of Lords as Viscount Montgomery of Alamein until he died in 1976, aged 88. These days, your opinion of Bernard Montgomery is probably based on where you're from. To the British, he's a hero, the saviour of Britain, the victor of Alamein, Sicily, and Normandy. To many Americans, however, Montgomery is seen as a foppish British dandy, the foil of their own heroic generals, especially Eisenhower and Patton. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle. Yes, Monty was vain, egotistical, and at times downright mean, but he was also a key figure in the Second World War, and his battles and his decisions will echo down through history for centuries after all of us are gone.
You know, saying if someone only didn't have this aspect of them is kind of the same fallacy of alternate history stuff, where, you know, you take one giant event out of history to see what would be different, but you keep every event in history to analyze this new thing you're trying to look at that were clearly influenced by this giant thing that you're taking out for this exercise, right? Alternate history, looking at it. The same thing goes, I think, a lot with people who are very capable in certain areas, asking, you know, why couldn't they just not have this thing? Maybe it sort of is what made them great. Clearly, they were great generals who weren't as difficult to work with, it seems. But at the end of the day, you know, his record seems to be pretty decent. And, yeah, I can, even from this far back, I'm trying to be like, but I feel like it's kind of my Americanness has this side of Montgomery. Just from an objective point of view, still seems very difficult. On a personal level, I think I would probably hate the guy from like what I've been told. But I admire it. Hate's a strong word. But yeah, it's really interesting figure to say the least. Yeah. Love y'all. Hope you're all doing well. Would appreciate any answers to anything I said. If I said something wrong, which I think I definitely did a few times this video, definitely call me out on it. Say where I was wrong. And hopefully I'll see you guys next video. Bye.